Well, hello, everybody. My name is John. I'm admissions officer here with HDS Admissions. Thank you so much for making the time to be able to attend this event tonight. Again, this is an event devoted to frequently asked questions about financial aid in order to give as much time as possible for the Director of Financial Aid, Beth Flaherty, to go through those questions. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her in just a moment. Just a reminder that the Q&A function will be open if you have questions you'd like to submit, but if you have questions about application deadlines, application components, admission questions, the most appropriate avenue for that would be our admissions at hds.harvard.edu email address. We can attend to those in that fashion. But if you have questions while we're going through the pre-submitted questions for tonight, go ahead and put them into the Q&A function in the Zoom. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Beth Flaherty, Director of Financial Aid, to go through your questions. Beth, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, John. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk with you tonight. I appreciate you submitting your questions. We got lots of good information, great questions you're all asking, and so hopefully we'll get a lot of your questions answered. I'm going to go ahead and just start with going down the list of the questions that have been asked. If there's follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer those after we sort of make it through the list. I want to get through as many as possible, but if we get short on time, I'll make sure that I leave time at the end to go back and address any questions that might be coming in through the chat. Excuse me. For those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Beth Flaherty. I'm the Director of Financial Aid here at HDS, and I'm very happy to be meeting with all of you tonight and hopefully getting a lot of your questions answered. So the first question that we got was asking about funding options, alternative funding options for the MRPL program. So I think it probably is helpful to start and say that we do offer institutional aid for two of our programs. We do not offer institutional aid for two of our other master's programs. So we do offer institutional aid for the MTS and the MDiv program, but the THM and the MRPL program, we do not offer institutional grant support. So no scholarship stipends, anything like that. However, the THM and the MRPL, as well as our other two master's programs, are all eligible for federal aid if the student is a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen. And an eligible non-citizen is typically a permanent resident. Those students are eligible for things like federal student loans and or federal work study. But in terms of grant support, those two one-year programs do not qualify for that. In terms of alternative funding options, it's really up to the student to find those resources. So I would recommend a couple of different things. I would recommend doing a Google search. I would cast a very wide net of scholarship opportunities, knowing that it can be an arduous process, but if you take the time to start now, hopefully you'll find some resources. I would speak with any mentors or faculty members in the particular area that you're interested in to find out if they have any suggestions of areas that you might be able to look to for funding. But finding additional resources will largely be on the student themselves. We unfortunately are a very small office of 2 people, and we do not have the ability to be able to compile outside scholarship resources for students. Next question is asking about how do you qualify for need-based versus merit-based aid, and wondering if having a previous master's degree will sort of keep you out of the running of institutional grant support. So that's a great question. So at HDS, for our MTS and our MDiv programs, we have 2 financial aid programs. We have the merit-based and the need-based. The merit-based does not require a financial aid application. It doesn't require an application at all for the merit-based. Merit is determined by the admissions committee, and it's based on the overall strength of your admissions application. So every student that submits an application for admission is considered for merit-based aid, but it's important to note that only about 10% of our admitted students will be offered a merit scholarship. So it's a very small amount of the funding that we have to offer. Our larger funding program is our need-based program, and that does require a financial aid application. So what will happen is, after the deadline for admissions in January, the admissions office will provide information to the financial aid office about who has applied for admissions, and then we will send information out to those students, those potential applicants, and let them know what the process for applying for need-based aid is. And so generally by middle of January, you should have an email from us with the instructions. If you are a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen, you'll fill out the HDS institutional application and the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. If you are an international student, you will simply fill out the institutional application for aid. And again, we'll send you the information, all the login instructions on how to do that, and you fill it out online. For the FAFSA, that does get processed through the Department of Education, so you do have to set up an account with them if you haven't filled out a FAFSA before, and you want to make sure that when you fill out the FAFSA, you are making sure that you are indicating that one of the schools you want your information to go to is Harvard Divinity School. If you use the generic Harvard code, it will go to the Harvard College and we'll never see it. So you want to make sure that if you're doing the drop-down menu, you're choosing Harvard Divinity School, and our school code is E00210, and that will be on the instruction information that we send you. And again, if you're an international student, you're just doing the HDS application, you're not eligible to fill out the FAFSA. And so when we're determining need, we're looking at a number of different factors. So we're looking at the information on your FAFSA as well as your institutional application. And we are looking at things, in addition to that, we also look at things like, is a student coming in with previous educational debt? We do give weight to debt from a master's program, but we give more weight to undergraduate debt because we see a number of students come in with pretty significant debt. So there are a number of different factors. And so the fact that you might have worked for a while and had a professional job doesn't necessarily mean you won't get need-based aid. But it doesn't mean that you will. So what we always recommend is fill out the application and let us determine if you're eligible or you're not eligible. Don't self-select yourself out. Unless you know that you have very significant income and assets, in which case, you may not be eligible. If you have specific questions about that, you could certainly send me an email. The best email address is financial_aid@hds.harvard.edu. And I'm happy to respond to any questions that you have there. And we generally can get back to you within a business day or so. But I recommend just go ahead and fill it out. If you think there's any possibility that you might need need-based aid, go ahead and do it. What I would not recommend is waiting to find out if you've been admitted to a program and then trying to apply for aid, because at that point it's often too late, because we send out notifications and oftentimes we don't have money to go back and reevaluate for students who were late and didn't apply on time. So it's important that you apply, and it's important that you meet the deadline. The deadline will be February 13th of 2026. It will be in the information that we send you. And the FAFSA does take a couple of business days to process, so we would recommend that you fill that out a couple of days in advance and not wait until the 13th to do it. If for some reason you have issues filling out the application or there are technical problems, we would recommend that you just be in touch with us and let us know that you're having a problem. If for some reason you don't receive an email from us by the end of January, because sometimes our emails do go to spam or junk mail folders, then I would go ahead and send us an email to financial_aid@hds.harvard.edu, and we'll make sure we resend you the information. Another thing I also want to mention here is that students often worry, if I need to apply for financial aid, does that mean I won't get admitted into the program? And I just do want to tell you that the admissions application process is need blind. So no one on the admissions committee knows who's applying for financial aid. They have no access to your financial aid applications, so you don't need to worry about that. The other common question we get is, do I have to provide my parents' information on the FAFSA or on the institutional application? And we're only looking for the information from the student and or their spouse if they're married. At the graduate level, we don't look at parental information, at least not at HDS. So I just want to make sure that we point that out because that's a very common question that we get. In terms of how do you get a merit, there is no right answer. And to be honest, you just want to put forth the best application that represents who you are, why you want to be at HDS, why now is the right time, and what are you going to do with this degree. If you focus too hard on compiling your application in hopes that you're going to get merit, our very savvy admissions team is going to see through that. So just put forth your best foot and the best application that you can put together and just let things work out the way that they will. In terms of the different types of funding in the merit-based program, if you are offered a merit award, you will be notified by the admissions office as part of your admissions notification. So you'll get a letter saying that you've been admitted, and then there's generally a second letter behind it offering you a merit award. You'll also get a letter from the financial aid office stating what the amount of the award is. But merit awards are typically full tuition and a modest stipend to help with living expenses. And there's a range in the stipend, but typically it's between $12,000 and $20,000. We give out very few of the $20,000 and more of the $12,000. In terms of the need-based aid, there are 3 different levels of need-based aid. There's a 75% tuition grant, a 100% tuition grant, and a 100% tuition grant with a modest stipend to help with living expenses. But it won't cover your entire cost of attendance, so that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. Do we have financial aid? Does financial aid and dual degrees with other schools? So if you are interested in the dual degree program, this is what happens. You apply for aid at both schools. And when you're at HDS, you get aid through HDS. And when you're not at HDS, you're basically on leave from us. And then when you're at the other school, then you get your aid from them. And then when you come back to HDS, you'll get your aid from us and you'll go on hold with the other school. There's only a couple of programs. I think it's the law school and the Kennedy School traditionally, where we have these joint degree programs. I think there's also one with Tough School Government. So the admissions office can give you more information on that. But it's important to note that the type of grant aid you get at one school could be significantly different from what you get at another school. So you can't assume that the packages will be the same. And so it's important to know that going in. The other thing that I think is important to know, and we're going to talk about student loans a little bit later on, but when you're doing a dual degree, because of a lot of changes happening with the student loan program, beginning with next year, there are changes in the types of student loans that students can borrow. And there are limits based on whether you're considered in a professional degree program or you're considered to be in a graduate school program. So if you're going to 2 different schools and one is considered a graduate school and one is considered a professional school, you're going to have different borrowing eligibilities. So these are things to keep in mind. Okay, so let's see. Information on what we should do to be able to receive financial aid. We sort of covered that. I would make sure that you apply and that you apply by the deadline. And again, if for some reason we will continue to send you information saying we're missing this. And if you get missing information letters from us, you should assume that means we don't have what you need to apply for the program. And so if you think you have submitted it already, you'll want to contact us. Oftentimes it's a FAFSA where a student either puts the wrong school code or they inadvertently put the wrong social security number on it, and so it doesn't match up with the social security number in our system. So if we continue to send you information saying we don't have parts of your application, please don't ignore that. Don't assume that we have it. Call us and we'll figure out how to problem solve. how your current income impacts your financial aid, what types of loans might be available if you don't qualify for financial aid. So your income does impact, but we also know that what you're earning now is not what you're going to be earning when you're in graduate school. So we do take it into consideration. We don't ignore your current income. And the income that we're looking at is your 2024 income. So it's not even the 2025, it's your 2024. But we also look at not only the income, but there are a number of different factors that we take into consideration. We also look at your assets and things on top of that. So what I would say to a student is, if you think there's something that we need to know that we don't ask for on the application, just go ahead and send us a separate email telling us what you'd like us to know about your situation, and we'll put that with your file so that we have that information when we're reviewing for financial aid. In terms of the types of loans, next year will be a little bit different. We will continue to be able to offer the Stafford Loan Program, the direct federal Stafford loan. But because of changes with the Big Beautiful Bill, the loan limits will be different depending upon which program you're in. So our understanding right now is that, and I want to make a big caveat here, this is our understanding now. There is lots of things to be finalized. But what we understand at this point is that the MTS will be considered a graduate degree, and the MDiv is likely to be considered a professional degree. And the difference is that in a graduate degree program, a student can borrow $20,500 per year for a direct unsubsidized Stafford loan. And they have a graduate loan aggregate borrowing of $100,000 for all graduate programs. It does not include undergraduate borrowing. For the MDiv, which is likely to be considered a professional program, you can borrow up to $50,000 per year minus any aid that you've been given by the school. So not every student will have the ability to borrow up to $50,000. And then you have an aggregate program, an aggregate loan limit of $200,000 for a professional program. So that would be the same if you were like in a law program or a medical school program. But a lot of other programs would follow under a graduate program. And so that's a little bit different this year. The other thing that's different is in previous years, there was a graduate plus loan for graduate students where they could borrow beyond the unsubsidized Stafford loan, and they could borrow up to the cost of attendance minus the Stafford loan and any other forms of aid that the school had offered. Graduate plus loans did require a credit check, but they had a much more favorable approval rate than a private loan did. So they didn't look at things like debt to income ratios. They looked mostly at bankruptcies, liens, charge-offs, and 90-day late adverse payments. Starting with the 26-27 school year, for new borrowers and new programs, the Graduate Plus loan will not be available. So if you needed to borrow beyond the Stafford loan program, you would have to look at a private student loan. And those do require credit checks, and they do look at things like debt to income ratios. So not every student will be eligible to borrow a private student loan, but some students will. So that's an important distinction to make from the current program to what's going to be happening next year. Okay. Which program increases your chance of financial aid? Between the MTS and the MDiv, there is no distinction, although we often hear students tell us that we give preference to one program over the other, and I can tell you 100% we don't. It doesn't matter which program you're enrolling in, we're just assessing it from a need-based perspective. So you're not going to have a better chance of getting a better package as an MDiv than you would as an MTS. Your chances are just as equal in both programs. What types of financial aid are offered? Are there separate funds for students with just an undergraduate degree? I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at with that particular question. But in terms of, aside from our institutional grant and stipend support, students can qualify for the federal student loans, and students that demonstrate need-based aid and are U.S. citizens or eligible non-citizens, in addition to being eligible for the federal student loans, can also qualify for federal work study. And that allows students to work on campus and get paid. It also helps the offices on campus because it allows them to hire students, but what the student is making is being subsidized by the Department of Education. So typically, if a student has a work study award, 30% of what they make gets paid by the department hiring them, and the other 70% is covered by the Department of Education. Because we get a certain allocation of work study from the university as a whole, and we only get a portion of it, we generally have to limit students to about $6,000 for a federal work study for the academic year. It's also important to note that we don't know what our work study allocation will be going forward under this new bill, so there are certainly potential for changes. But I will say that many of our students do participate in federal work study and are able to be hired on campus. If you don't have federal work study, that doesn't mean that you won't be eligible to work on campus. For a student that doesn't have work study, either because they don't meet the qualifications, because they don't have financial need, or they're an international student and aren't eligible for the program, they could often be hired on campus. The only drawback to not having work study is you typically won't have as much selection of positions, but many students are able to work on campus. And what will happen is with work study, we do not prepackage it, so you will not see it on your initial award letter. We will send you information once you've been admitted about how to know if you might be eligible. You'll contact us. We'll let you know if it looks like you have eligibility, and then we'll walk you through the process. But once you're admitted into a program and you receive your Harvard key, which is your Harvard ID and PIN number, then you'll get access to the Student Employment Office, and you'll be able to search for positions throughout the summer. You find a position you're interested in, you apply for it, and if you're hired, you come back to us at usually mid-August, and then we'll have you fill out the work study request form to officially request your work study eligibility. Another thing to note about work study is that in our MDiv program, there is a field education component, and a large majority of those placements are covered by work study. So that's something that's helpful for students to know. Any resources available to international students in the MTS program? International students are eligible for all of the same institutional funding that domestic students are. So you're eligible for the merit-based program, you're eligible for all the same levels of funding in the need-based program. The only difference is that international students are not eligible for federal student loans, and we don't have a program for international students to borrow that doesn't require a cosigner. So if a student is an international student and has a US-based credit-worthy cosigner, they could potentially apply for a private loan and be approved. But we don't have an international program, or HDS does not participate in a program that doesn't require a student to have some sort of a cosigner. Strategies for pursuing funding outside of HCS. Again, a lot of this is looking on your own. If you're coming into a master's program, I would also recommend looking at your alma maters, particularly if you're in the MDiv program and you have a religious affiliation. I would check with your religious tradition to see if there are scholarships available. I would talk to any mentors or faculty members in your area of interest to see if there are particular areas that they're aware of that you might want to look at. And again, cast a wide net. I know often students hate the Google recommendation, but we do definitely have some students that can find some funding by casting a very wide net. What I wouldn't do is don't wait until you're admitted to start looking for outside scholarships. I would start looking now, even if the deadlines won't happen for a couple of months. You just want to start getting an idea of what's available and what you should be preparing for these outside scholarship applications. What does the need-based assistance process look like? Does it account for dependents? So we do look at that in the calculation for need-based aid. So if you do have dependents, that is factored into part of the whole calculation. I won't go back through the need-based assistance process because we already talked about that, but we do account for dependents if you have them. Is it difficult for international students to apply for or be awarded with financial aid? As I said before, they're eligible for the same funding as any student would be. And around how many students awarded merit-based aid each year? It's about 10% of the admitted class, and I don't have the breakdown on how it is international versus domestic. But as I said, any student that submits an application for admissions will be considered for merit funding. It is important also to note on the merit part is if you do not receive merit in your first year, you will not be reassessed for merit in the second or third year of your program. It's also important to note that whatever you get for a need-based scholarship is likely going to be the scholarship you're going to get for the duration of your program that you applied to. We don't go back and we do require you to reapply for need-based aid each year, and you have to continue to make satisfactory progress both for merit and need-based aid, but we don't increase in the second and third year. On the flip side, it's also particularly in the need-based program, it's unlikely that your grant would be reduced unless your income and assets changes significantly. And by significantly, I don't mean a couple $1,000s. I mean really significantly. In the almost 20 years I've been here, I can think of probably 7 or 8 cases in that entire time where we had to reduce someone's institutional grant. And it was often someone that married someone with very significant assets and income. If there are concerns for you, if you're worried about that, I would say send me an email and we can have a conversation about it. In the merit-based program, the stipend that you will, the grant and the stipend that you get is good for the length of the program that you apply to. Another thing that we've recently changed this year is we have made a change to our packaging policy for students that switch from one program to the other. So if you start off in the MTS and you decide that you're going to switch programs to the MDiv, we will not guarantee that in fact, your aid will not remain the same. If you are in a merit-based program, your aid is not going to carry over to, if you go from MTS to MDiv, it will not carry over. If you got merit aid and didn't apply for need-based aid, you could apply for need-based aid in the third year of the program, but we couldn't guarantee that you would get need-based aid. We'd have to wait and see what that application is. If you get need-based aid and you switch from MTS to MDiv, the maximum grant that you would receive if you switch programs in that third year, you'd receive whatever you get the first 2 years, but in the third year, we would only offer you a 50% tuition grant. So that's really important for people to make sure that you're applying to the right program. We know sometimes you get here and things change, and so there is flexibility. You certainly could change a program, but the funding will be significantly different or could be significantly different. So it's important that you're making sure that you're applying to the program that best fits you. Okay, I think a lot of these are repeat questions, so I think for the most part we have covered pretty much everything that people have submitted. So I'm going to go to the chat and see if we have any questions. Oh, we've got some Q&As. Okay, let's see. The question in the chat is asking about for international students funding options and maximum financial aid. So the maximum financial aid for any student in the need-based program would be full tuition and a stipend. The stipend will be modest, so it will not cover your entire cost of attendance. So particularly in the case of an international student, you need to keep in mind that in order to get a visa, you have to certify that you have the cost of attendance minus what the school is providing you. So even with the student that gets our best need-based program, there's still usually a very significant amount that they still need to certify that they have from outside resources, either from a private scholarship or a sponsorship or family support. There can be a number of different ways that you can make up the difference. But it is important to know that we don't have any program, either need-based or merit-based aid, that's going to fully fund the entire cost of attendance. So many students will need to figure out how they're going to make up that difference. For international students, that will largely come to, will you have sponsorship? Will you have family support, your own resources? For domestic students, it will often be a combination of all that and also maybe some borrowing as well. So it's important to think ahead about what your plans are for that and how you might make that work. And also, this is a great opportunity for you to think about, how do you feel about debt? How much feels like too much debt? Because what we don't want is a student to get themselves into a situation where they took out all these loans and they didn't really think through how that might impact them or how they feel about it. I tell the story about an MDiv student that I had several years ago. He took out a total of $5,000 in student loans over the 3-year MDiv, just a total of $5,000. He had no undergraduate debt. He had more anxiety over that $5,000 than any student I've ever met in my life. So just because it's a small amount to borrow doesn't mean that it won't cause you anxiety. So it is a good idea to start thinking about how do you feel about that? And also, what are your other plans? Are you thinking about going into another degree beyond this? Maybe law school or other things like that. You also have to be thinking with these new loan limitations, how that might impact things. And again, if you have questions about that, I'm happy to walk you through as best I can with the information that I currently have. Another question is significant non-educational debt considered as well? We don't take that into consideration. We can't take things like credit card debt or medical debt or institutional, just regular debt that a student has. We have very little leeway in what we can take into consideration. But educational debt is certainly something that we can, but we don't take consumer debt into consideration. Does HGS operate similarly to HU in general when it comes to everyone making under certain income yearly getting some guaranteed student aid? Unfortunately, no. Harvard College, I should say, the undergraduate college has very generous financial aid, and they can fund students 100% up to their need. I don't know of any graduate school at Harvard that is able to do that. And even a place like HGS that has very generous aid, we can't do that. And so we don't, when you hear something about the financial aid program being based on a family making under a certain amount of dollars, you can pretty much always assume it pertains to only Harvard College and not to the other schools at Harvard. If I want to go to HGS and I am an international student on an F1 master's, would I still be eligible for any financial aid, merit-based scholarships, if any? If you're on a student visa, you certainly are eligible for aid. I'm not familiar with the other types of visas that students might be applying for, so I would actually recommend talking to our registrar's office that does the certification of it. But we have had people that have qualified for other types of visas and may still qualify for institutional aid. So I wouldn't say that that would keep you out of it, but if you have questions about certain visa types, I would recommend talking to the registrar's office. Would sharing a note about our personal circumstances to the aid office be encouraged or help? you certainly can send us anything that you want us to know about. It doesn't necessarily mean we can take it all into consideration, but oftentimes it's helpful for us to have context, because there may be something in your situation that would be helpful for us to know. So I would say after you submit all the financial aid applications, materials, just send us an email to the financial aid email address and just say, here are some things I'd like you to know about my situation. And I can tell you, we look at every single one that comes in. So we match it up with your file, and we do look at it and review it. And sometimes it does make a difference. So it's certainly worth sending it in. I wouldn't send it in if it's like, 1 year I made $5,000 less than previously. That probably wouldn't change your situation significantly. But certainly you're welcome to tell us whatever it is you think is pertinent for us to know. Is there any additional support for housing expenses outside stipends for merit/need-based scholarship, especially at the Center for the Study of World Religion dorms? What additional resources are available to help students find affordable housing? So in terms of if you get a stipend either in the need-based or in the merit program, you can certainly use those funds to help with living expenses, but it won't cover everything. In terms of discounted housing at the Study of World Religion, there isn't discounted housing. You apply through them, you be accepted through them, but whatever their going rate is what they charge students. And so if we have a stipend, you could certainly use that towards helping you pay that monthly rent, but there isn't a subsidy for living in those. Students can apply to live in some of the Harvard dormitory housing. This year, HDS has partnered with the law school, and we're using one of their dorms, and many of our students are living in that dorm, and it's significantly less expensive than getting an apartment either off campus or renting through Harvard Real Estate. I am not sure if that agreement is going to continue on past this year. I don't know that that decision has been made yet. But even when we didn't have that agreement with the law school, there are other schools at Harvard, like the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences and the Harvard Business School, that will often have leftover dorm rooms that their own students don't want, and they will open it up to students at other schools. So sometimes it's possible to live in a dorm even if we don't have the same agreement with the law school next year. We always recommend that students look for living with roommates because that will certainly cut your costs. Trying to live outside of Harvard University rented apartments. Living in Harvard real estate is great because they often are in great areas and well maintained and close to campus, but it's the going rate for Cambridge. It's not discounted. And so Harvard is serving as your landlord, but there's no discount for living in those particular apartments. And those apartments can be quite expensive. We would recommend looking off campus. And so even if you look in Somerville, like HDS is right on the Somerville-Cambridge line. So Somerville can be much less expensive. Brighton, Alston, we have some students that live in Watertown or Arlington, accessible by public transportation, but still, easy to get to campus, but sometimes less expensive. And we always recommend trying to get a roommate if you can. Our Office of Student Life, once students have been accepted into a degree program, you'll get information from the Office of Student Life. They'll have opportunities for you to connect with current students for information about how to find cheaper housing. Also, they usually connect students on how to contact if they're looking for roommates or looking to pull someone into their lease, or if they're trying to get out of a lease and, make it available so that students can find these resources. So we don't have, a dedicated housing office, but we do have resources that can point you in the right direction. Someone recommended looking at FastWeb. That's a great recommendation. Scholarships.com, College Board's Big Future, Going Merry. Those are great recommendations. Some of them can be a little frustrating because it feels like there's a lot more advertisements than there are actual scholarships. But it's definitely worth taking the time to go through those sites. I am curious why the general online application asks about our financial application. Maybe John can chime in about this. I didn't think that the admissions application asks about financial situation.
That's correct, Beth. Sorry, it was glitched on my end. It should not ask that. But I don't know if this is you're referring to the general online application, like the FAFSA, or for is it financial aid? Or are you referring to the application for admission? If you could put that in the Q&A, that might be helpful too, just so we know.
Great, thank you. When considering the need-based aid, is there a way we can account for expenses that are not obvious, like debts, but will affect our living situation, such as taking care of a family abroad or similar? Unfortunately, we don't consider those expenses. When we're looking at funding, we're looking at funding the individual student. And so we don't take into consideration family situation in terms of, unless you're married or have dependent children, we obviously take that into consideration. But if you're helping family abroad, we don't take that into consideration when determining your need-based eligibility. And we don't take, other than educational debt, we don't take that into consideration. Another thing I want to mention is that when you put your assets on the institutional application, we only want you to tell us about non-retirement assets. So if you have a 401k or a 403b or an IRA, don't list those amounts. We don't need to know about that. Those are protected. And if you were to try to take them out now, you'd be hit with a lot of penalties and fees. We only want things that are non-related. Now, if you consider it to be a retirement account, like say, for example, you have stocks and bonds and you think about that covering your retirement, but it's not in a retirement protected account, you do need to list that on your application material. Can an international student be accepted for both merit and need-based aid? And can it be combined for tuition and stipend? That's a good question. No. And this is for any student. You either receive need-based aid or you receive merit-based aid, but you don't receive both. So there's no combining the two programs together. The MDiv application asks if we identify as having a difficult financial situation. John, you can correct me, but I think it asks if you identify as being from a lower socioeconomic background.
That's right, Beth. I did just type an answer into the Q&A as well, but
Oh, I'm
correct.
sorry.
There's the low socioeconomic status question that we ask, and the first generation student question that we ask, which are means for us to better understand the applicant pool. There is a difficult financial situation question that is in reference to the application fee, which you can request a waiver for. But there shouldn't be a question asking for any specifics. And again, the answers to those questions are not relayed to financial aid either. We don't communicate those.
Do you take disability into consideration? In terms of determining need-based aid, we're just looking at the financial information that you have provided. If there are medical concerns or, ongoing medical concerns that you're concerned about, I certainly would recommend sending us an email, just sort of, telling us what you're concerned about, and we can tell you how we might be able to address that. Typically, we don't take medical expenses into consideration in terms of we don't give you more grant aid, but we do have students that have ongoing medical concerns while they're here, and sometimes need to borrow additional funds to help cover those out-of-pocket expenses. And so in the case of a loan situation, we might be able to increase a student's eligibility for loans in order to be able to borrow for that, but we typically don't take that into consideration for need-based aid. But if you have a particular situation you're concerned about, I would just recommend sending me an email, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you. I can, we can have a Zoom conversation, we can correspond through email, I can give you a call, whichever works. But I would certainly just recommend that you email us. right, I think we've come to the end of the question and answers. Are there any more anybody wants to add to the chat? One thing I do want to add is that I probably should have prefaced with at the beginning. Even though HGS doesn't cover 100% of students' cost for the program, we do award a really sizable amount of financial aid, and about 90% of our students are receiving some sort of institutional scholarship. So about 10% of our students are paying full tuition, but about 90% are getting at least a 75% tuition grant, and some are getting full tuition, and some are also getting some stipend on top of that. So it's important to note that a large percentage of students are going to qualify for need-based aid here. And when myself and my colleague look at the financial information, we go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and if there are things that we think might put someone on the bubble, oftentimes we'll go back to a student and ask for some clarifying information, just to make sure that we know everything about the situation. We do, like I said, if you send us an email about your situation, we look at all of that information to make sure that we know for sure. We have a good idea of what your situation is. One thing that I should also mention is, we get this question a lot, is can I call and negotiate? And the package that we offer you is the maximum package that we will be able to provide. So we do not go back and negotiate. If you get a different offer from a different school, we certainly understand you have to take those into consideration, but we don't match what another school has offered you. It's also important to note that many of the schools that you will be applying to don't actually have a need-based aid component. They typically, many of them are just merit-based and will only be looking at academic merit, and they don't look at financial aid. At HGS, we're kind of the reverse. We give a little bit in need-based aid, but the bulk of it is, we give a little bit in merit-based aid, but the bulk of it is need-based aid. Another question was asking, can you choose between the need-based and the merit-based offers? You don't choose which one you qualify for. We make that determination. So the admissions office would decide who the merit recipients are, and then everyone else that hasn't been put forth with a merit award but has applied for need-based aid by the need-based deadline of February 13th will be considered for need-based aid and will be awarded out of that pool. Okay, and the last question I see is wondering if my need would be based upon the FAFSA amount. If so, is this the tax amount from the year before? Yes, it would be based on the 2024. But again, as I said earlier in the conversation, and you may have not been present for it, if there's something that you think we need to know, please send us an email to financial_aid@hgs.harvard.edu, and we'll put that with your file. We do recognize that most students are going to have a reduction in their income, so that's not surprising to us. But we are basing it on the 2024 income and then whatever your current day assets are. All right, I don't see anything else.
But there may be one more question, Beth, about are there any common mistakes made on the financial aid application?
The biggest mistake people make is they don't apply. Or they'll fill out the FAFSA and not the institutional application, or they'll do the institutional application and not the FAFSA. And again, if you're a domestic student, you need to do both the FAFSA and the institutional application. And if you're international, you just do the institutional application. The other mistake I think people make is they will sometimes make the mistake of including their retirement funds as part of their assets. And if it's in a retirement protected fund, we don't want you to tell us about that. We'll say that on the application, but don't include anything that's in a retirement protected. So don't put in a 401k or a 403b or an IRA. But as I said a little earlier, if you have stocks or other, cash, what have you, and you think of that as retirement, but it's not in a retirement protected account, you do have to include that. One other thing that I think is important to note is if you are married at the time you're filling out the FAFSA and the institutional application, but you were not married in the previous tax year, you still have to include your spouse's assets. And your spouse will have to consent to if you're filling out the FAFSA, they will have to consent to the IRS data retrieval that pulls your tax information from 2024. So keep that in mind as well, that you do have to provide that information if you're married at the time of filling out the information. And lastly, I would just say, if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have something that you feel is a dumb question, don't be afraid to ask us. Send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. If you think it's stupid, it's probably not stupid, and I'm not going to tell you even if it is. So please go ahead and ask your questions. We want to make sure that you have as much information as possible when you're going through this whole process. And we like to think of ourselves as being pretty approachable. So please be in touch.
Okay. Beth, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Again, this session is recorded, so we'll have it posted to our website within a couple of days. As Beth mentioned, if you have any questions moving forward, please don't hesitate to reach out either to financial aid or to our admissions inbox, and we can get you to the right place as well. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight, and a special thanks to Beth, who did a great job answering questions and for steering this conversation. We're looking forward to seeing all of your applications in the future, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.